Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing study of Vietnam. In our previous lectures, we've talked about the leader of South Vietnam in the years just after the Geneva Accords, Wo Dinh Diem. In this lecture, we turn to a look at the President of the United States, beginning after his election in 1960, John F. Kennedy, and the men who advised him. We'll talk about Kennedy's approach to the ongoing crisis in Vietnam and some of the decisions that led the United States to become more deeply involved in that situation. After his historic presidential election in 1960, John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency in early 1961. His inaugural address included many famous phrases, including the following: "Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it, and the glow from that fire can truly light the world." Kennedy was a man determined to achieve greatness. He believed his own words, that he was poised at the brink of a critical time, and that he would meet that challenge. He had been a sickly child, and spent his life trying to prove his manly valor. He was intensely afraid of failure and the appearance of weakness. His father, Joe Kennedy, raised all his sons to show courage, drive, and manliness. They played sports constantly and jockeyed amongst themselves. JFK also loved to read and drank in tales of King Arthur and westerns, tales of greatness and heroism. He attended an elite prep school and then Harvard University. He fought in World War II in the Navy and was much heralded for his heroism when his PT-109 was destroyed by a Japanese ship and he saved the life of a fellow crew member. Also during World War II, his older brother, Joe Jr., was killed. Kennedy was now the next in line for the political career that his father had envisioned. In 1946, he ran for representative from Massachusetts and won easily. He spent his years in the Senate after being elected in 1952, grooming himself for the presidency, maintaining a reasonably moderate record and building connections. He also battled pain and hardship throughout this period. He underwent several operations and suffered anemia, asthma, and other ailments, but he refused to show weakness. He was also notorious for his conquests of women, which became another mechanism for demonstrating his strength. He often engaged in one-night stands, not even learning the names of the women he was with. Stories of these sexual escapades indicate that they were not romantic or warm affairs, but rather brief and callous conquests. In 1960, after a long campaign for the presidency, he fought against Richard Nixon in a series of televised campaigns, some of the most famous in the history of presidential elections. On the strength of his performance in those televised campaigns, he won the election in one of the narrowest margins in American history. The Kennedy White House and the administration came to be infused with an atmosphere of money, power, courage, sensuality, and intellect. The Kennedys were surrounded by glamorous and talented people, from athletes and astronauts to Rhodes Scholars, Nobel laureates, prize-winning writers, and poets. Kennedy's White House came to be nicknamed Camelot, which happened to be the name of his favorite musical at that time, but also reflects an image of gallantry, white knights, and damsels in distress. Kennedy's advisors in many ways shaped the policy that the United States would wage in Vietnam for years to come. With rare exception, they believed completely in the idea of containment and the global threat of communism. It's worth studying their views a little bit more in detail here, as they were so influential on the policies to come. Kennedy's Secretary of State was Dean Rusk. Rusk came from Georgia. In some ways, he didn't fit the New England elite profile of the Kennedy administration, but he had taken a Rhodes Scholarship and attended Oxford University. He watched World War II while in Europe and determined never to commit the sin of appeasement. He never doubted that Ho Chi Minh was part of a global communist conspiracy. He was a hardliner who never questioned American commitment in Vietnam, even in his retirement later. Another advisor was Walt W Rostow, an economist at MIT. He was an award-winning writer and scholar. He was an expert on modernization. He theorized that Vietnam was vulnerable to communist infiltration while in the early stages of modernization. He encouraged accelerated modernization and American protection to guide Vietnam to modern society. He also viewed the need to use military force to cut off the Viet Cong from supply lines to the north. He encouraged bombing. Even late in life, he thought the only American failing was not committing enough firepower to the task. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense was Robert S. McNamara, perhaps the most famous of his advisors. McNamara was a Berkeley grad with a Harvard MBA, a so-called whiz kid who reached the presidency of the Ford Motor Company at age 44. He thought there was no way that a fourth-rate country like Vietnam could stand up to American firepower. He took his first trip to Vietnam in 1961 and made up his mind quickly. Upon return, he said, "North Vietnam will never beat us. They can't even make ice cubes." McNamara assumed control over the war, establishing goals and objectives, selecting targets, and measuring progress. He had ultimate faith in American technology and power. Late in life, McNamara admitted that he had made some misguided decisions and the Americans had made mistakes in a famous documentary called The Fog of War. But for many, those apologies came far too little and far too late to make any difference. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Kennedy was General Maxwell Taylor. He was considered by some the father of airborne warfare. A graduate of West Point in 1922, he served in North Africa and Sicily and parachuted into France on D-Day with the 101st Airborne. He disagreed with the policy of the New Look under Eisenhower, which threatened nuclear attack at every opportunity. He advocated instead so-called flexible response, which allowed for limited warfare in certain circumstances. The Army and Marine Corps should remain strong and well-equipped, according to Taylor. He was also a major advocate for counterinsurgency. You must attempt to win political support while undermining that of the enemy. His theories were published in a bestseller in 1959, The Uncertain Trumpet, which drew the eye of JFK. He appointed him to the staff in 1962. Another of Kennedy's advisors was George Bundy. He was brilliant and impatient with lesser minds. He was born in Boston in 1919 to an aristocratic family, graduated from Yale in 1940, and ultimately became a professor at Harvard, even rising to the Dean of Arts and Sciences in 1953. He was brought in to serve JFK as special assistant to the president for national security affairs. He was another hardliner and a firm believer in the efforts in Vietnam. In general, Kennedy's advisors were caught up in the post-World War II consensus of American dominance. They represented money, top corporations, universities, and the military. Many had their first experiences with war during World War II, and it intoxicated them. They were convinced at the dominance of the U.S. military, technology, and invention. They remembered the dark times of the Great Depression, which had been saved by the war. World War II was the good war. Good versus evil was very clear, and the good guys won. In the post-war world, communism was the new threat, and the United States simply had to dedicate the same energy to defeating them. Debate over Vietnam policy started very early in the Kennedy presidency. The hardliners wanted victory, and many urged military intervention. McGeorge Bundy and others urged attacks against the Viet Cong. Send in ground troops and use strategic bombing, they said. Rostow and Taylor urged flexible response and counterinsurgency. Few urged caution. One of those was George Ball, the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. Ball had undergraduate degrees from Northwestern, worked in the Lend-Lease program during World War II, and kept records of the bombings in London during the war. Ball was convinced that massive bombing campaigns in World War II had done little to damage the productive capacity of Germany, but had done much to contribute to the will and anger of the enemy. He argued that a war in Asia was not what the United States needed, and that there was no practical way to prevent Ho Chi Minh from prevailing in Vietnam. At a 1961 meeting with Kennedy, he argued that with the introduction of American ground troops, quote, within 5 years there will be 300,000 American soldiers fighting in Vietnam. Kennedy merely laughed and said, George, you're crazier than hell. Thus, the one man in the Kennedy administration urging caution was silenced. In our next lecture, we'll continue the discussion of Kennedy and his presidency and some of his early actions in Vietnam.